Okay, hello, welcome to the Knowledge Panel, episode 4, everybody. And this one is JavaScript. How can JavaScript help and hurt your SEO? So there's one person that we have to have here for this. And of course, it is Stewart Mohammadi. How do I pronounce him? Mohammadi.
Yeah, Mohammadi.
That's all right. Not so bad.
Yeah.
Mohammadi from. Why don't you start by introducing yourself, Stuart, and we'll get on to the second in command. The other one later.
Well, thank you, Dixon. Stewart Mohammadi. I've been chasing the SEO dragon now for about 15 years, and I've worked agency side, in-house, and as a consultant for a panoply of large and small businesses alike. So I'm happy to be here.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for coming in, Stuart. I really appreciate it. I found this guy answering my pleas for him to come onto my show. So, Martin, why don't you say who you are and as if my audience doesn't know.
So first things first, thanks for having me. Thanks for bringing me onto this panel.
Thank you.
And I work for this startup in Mountain View that tries to do something completely different than everyone else on the web, and we're trying to basically revolutionize the way that people work with web catalogs and domain listings. So that will be interesting to see. Maybe we fail. Maybe this becomes useful. Who knows?
So you're a big shopping site then?
Kind of. You basically just submit your links and then we put them in the right categories, and then
Okay.
We also offer a backlink scheme on guest posts if you're interested. But yeah.
Okay. For those that don't know Martin is the JavaScript guru at Google, and none of what he just said is government policy. Is Google policy? I'm sure.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay. So and for those who don't know me, I'm Dixon Jones. I'm the CEO of InLinks and Entity Toolset. And as it's nice that I can be kindly sponsoring my own show every now and then. So here's my advert. If you haven't played with InLinks yet, why not get yourself onto one of the demos? Just go to inlinks.net and you'll find it, and sign up and you have a one-to-one demo and you get 30 minutes of me telling you why it's a really good idea. So that's enough of that. The end of my sponsorship thing. Let's get on to the episode. And JavaScript is it today. So clearly absolutely excited to have you guys on. Thank you for having a question coming up. We're streaming live on Facebook and we're on YouTube. In fact, why don't I bring my producer in, David, and make sure that there's everything I've mentioned. What have I brought in, David? How can people hear about us?
So we've set up a Facebook Live event, and we should be streaming live on there. I couldn't find the Facebook Live, so what I've done is I've shared the YouTube video as a post on the Facebook event. So we're certainly streaming live on YouTube, perhaps streaming live on Facebook via YouTube, and also streaming live on Twitter. We've just tweeted live as well. So catch us on YouTube and Facebook if you want to catch a future episode as well.
And if you're podcasting, you found us on iTunes or Google Play or whatever you've found us on. So thank you very much for coming on. So, right, start a question, really. Since the whole point of the episode is to find out, how JavaScript can help or hurt your SEO. Guys, why don't you just, so we don't miss it, so we don't miss the one point that you think everybody should take away. And I'll start with you, Stuart. What is the one thing that people get wrong with JavaScript when it comes to SEO or writing?
I think they tend to think that JavaScript is either the devil incarnate in terms of SEO. I think that's the biggest takeaway. For most SEOs, we don't want to be using JavaScript, and just mere mention of it will make us panic and break into a cold sweat. So I think that's the biggest misconception, but again, it is a misconception. But there are some issues with JavaScript, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But
okay, Martin, one thing.
Similarly, actually, this idea that JavaScript is a religion that you either need to love or hate, I think is not correct. It's a tool. It has its purposes, and when you use them, when you use the tool for the purposes that it fits, a fantastic tool. Otherwise, using it just because it's the only tool you've got is risky and most oftentimes not appropriate. And then you can paint yourself into a corner that's really hard to get out of. So It's a tool. It has its purposes. It's not the silver bullet. It's not the devil.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so obviously Google doesn't hate JavaScript these days. You know, there was a time when we kind of thought that, you know, Google just doesn't like JavaScript, but that was born out of it was hard to crawl. So really, let's hear it from the horse's mouth. How good is Google at looking at JavaScript generally now compared to, say, 3 years ago?
I think like a lot better. JavaScript as well as the Google crawling and rendering infrastructure have evolved a lot. As you probably know, it took us quite a while to get the rendering part of the infrastructure to use the latest version of Chromium. So since May 2019, we are basically having an evergreen Googlebot, which means that we are updating as Chrome updates on stable. Which means that we are running JavaScript pretty exactly as it runs in the browser, which hasn't been the case 3 years ago.
And is that totally accurately, or is there stuff that's missing?
I mean, the Googlebot is a browser that is a little different from your normal desktop browser. One of the more obvious examples is probably that on a browser, you can totally request access to microphone and camera and maybe get the user to actually say, yeah, sure, you can have that. Whereas what would that look like for Googlebot? So no, it rejects that. Another thing is specifically as Googlebot wants to get the first visitor experience of your site and service workers, which is a piece of JavaScript that you can kind of install on the user's device in the browser or in their browser, that allows different interactions on repeat visits. We are not installing that one. We are rejecting the request to install a service worker. So there are differences. Another one is purely technical, which is if you're relying on WebSockets. WebSockets are not implemented in Googlebot, so they are failing when you try to establish a WebSocket connection. So there are differences. But they are minor.
So for the uninitiated, possibly like me, what's a WebSocket?
So if you normally open a website, your browser sends a request over a TCP connection, making an HTTP request, and then gets a response back. But there is a possibility to make an HTTP request that basically opens a persistent connection that permanently stays open. And then you have bidirectional communication, basically real time through that connection. That's a WebSocket.
Okay. And you don't support that. Well, probably there's a whole load of questions around supporting that anyway. So that's fun. So Stewart, I mean, are you finding that they're getting much better and they're pretty good at the JavaScript nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, to Martin's point, I think the vast improvement in the ability to render and understand JavaScript. I think it's a phenomenon that's maybe, and Martin could be specific, but I think it's only a year or two old in terms of like how good Google's become at understanding and parsing and rendering JavaScript. Now, keep in mind, I mean, we love Google, but Google's one engine of many engines, and I think Google may be the at the forefront of sort of understanding and rendering JavaScript. So, you know, most of your traffic's going to go to Google, so certainly that's a good thing, especially if you're relying on JavaScript. But you know, depending on where you are in the world or your preference in terms of, you know, the search engine you prefer, it may not be such a great thing for your SEO on those engines.
Right. So I mean, it used to take a long time for Google to sort of crawl the JavaScript and stuff. And we were saying before the call, Stewart, you're saying 90 seconds at the outside, you know, so and I'd agree, you know, it's basically the same time. And I've seen a presentation on the web rendering service from Martin. So I know it's pretty much the same time, you know, on average. Have you got a KPI time, Martin, that you're trying to get down to?
We don't really have a goal in terms of time, because time surprisingly
it's fast enough, I think now.
It's quite fast. Yeah. Time isn't the biggest struggle, kind of.
Yeah. Okay. No.
Well, but also to that point, like the rendering of the JavaScript, actually, it's not really about time. It's about and I know Martin kind of cringes when this is brought up, but like crawl budget for a particular site, like your crawl budget will sort of, that's where the rendering of JavaScript is really taken out of. So it's about time, but again, Google's trying to process, you know, 100+ plus trillion pages. And so if you, you know, depending on how large your site is, it could take a little longer. And so it may, I'm sure we'll get into this later, but it may take longer for JavaScript to render on larger sites, depending on the quality of those pages that are in the index.
Right, but we're still talking seconds, not days now, aren't we?
Yeah. And
yeah.
With regards to crawl budget really is just crawling. It's not like rendering. If you have a website with 1 million pages that has no JavaScript whatsoever, and you have one that has JavaScript on it whatsoever, like there would not be a difference in terms of how fast new pages get indexed or old pages get updated. That is purely crawling related. But there is a point which is JavaScript resources and API calls, which oftentimes happen in client-side rendered JavaScript applications. They do count against your crawl budget. So that is a case, but that's not really the delay in terms of how fast we can render. When we say like how fast we can render, you have to like look at different numbers actually. One is the crawl budget that you have available, which for most sites is not a problem. And then you have the queue time, which means like we have understood that there is a page that we want to render. Every page goes to rendering, no matter if it has JavaScript or not. So you basically get queued for rendering, and then there's an available instance that actually does the render. How long is the time in between? That on average is, I think, 5 seconds at this point. I'm not exactly sure. I would have to double check, but I think the average or the median is 5 seconds. And then the actual rendering. So like basically what happens in your browser as well. When you open the page until the page is done, how long does that take? That can take a second, that can take a minute, that can take 2 minutes, hypothetically 10 minutes. But yeah, there's like different bits and pieces.
It's not long. So, but okay. So, I mean, people used to say that JavaScript slows a site down. Is that still true? I mean, I'm seeing quite a lot of fast JavaScript-driven sites. So, I mean, is JavaScript slowing sites down? Because isn't there two different things? Because if a server's already getting hit with a database calls and things, then actually the JavaScript should speed up a site it's got just as much argument to speed up a site as it has to slow down a site. What do you think? Or am I just wishing that JavaScript was quicker?
Do you want to take that one?
Stuart?
So you can actually run the speed test in terms of like mobile friendliness for any given page or any given website. And so that will tell you how you can speed up or give you suggestions for how you can speed up a page or the page speed. And usually what I found is that there are some unformatted JavaScript or JavaScript that's poorly formatted or extraneous JavaScript can be a factor in terms of slowing down your page speed. But, you know, again, like, is it JavaScript? Is it Google? It tends to be poorly done JavaScript that's slowing you down. It's not JavaScript inherently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And also,
how much bad stuff is out there, Martin?
A lot, unfortunately. Alex Russell has like a bunch of investigations when it comes to that. And it's, I think it's a tricky one. So generally, as was just said, JavaScript is not per se making things slower. It is incorrect application of JavaScript or using JavaScript for things that it shouldn't be used for. One beautiful example is there's a lot of stuff that you can do in terms of like menus and responsiveness on a site that you can do with CSS and HTML. And these are inherently a lot faster because they are declarative and the browser can basically start parsing them as they arrive. And if you then basically say like, no, all of the interactions, all of the things that you can do on this website depend on this 1 megabyte JavaScript to download and this other 1 megabyte JavaScript of dependencies that needs to download up front, then that means that you are basically making everything in the browser, including Googlebot, including your users, wait for that to happen until they can actually get the content and the interactions. But that's not because JavaScript is at play. It's because JavaScript is being used for something that it shouldn't be used for in the first place. That's one problem. The other problem is that with the proliferation of tools, which I think is great because we have lots of people coming from different backgrounds and building things for different purposes, we have lots of tools to pick from. And unfortunately, that also led to a lot of people changing tools quite frequently, which means they understand they can work with them reasonably well to build something that is potentially put into production. but they don't understand the tools well enough to actually build something properly. Back in the days where there was like 2 frameworks to pick from, you would pick one, then learn that for a couple of years, and then you would basically be like, oh yeah, I ran into all the problems I could run into. At this point, I know how to use my tools. But now with like new tools coming out every couple of weeks, there is a tendency to jump between tools and basically be like, I love this tool. Oh, there's a problem. Okay, and then I use this other tool, then I won't have that problem. And then they run into the exact same problem because they haven't taken the time to actually understand what's fundamentally problematic about what they're doing.
That's a philosophical question about society, really, not thinking deep enough about, and we're all becoming generalists, not experts, possibly. So
yeah.
Well, it's also the same phenomenon around code bloat, right? So like HTML code bloat is the same, and you definitely have JavaScript code bloat. You have legacy systems that maybe say you're using Node, and then they all decide, you know what, we should catch up to the times and use React or Angular. And then in that sort of changeover, you've got now legacy JavaScript where how do you reconcile this with what you're trying to achieve now? So again, you create a system that becomes a bit of a hackathon.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, so I use, for example, so we use on Inlinks, we got a little bit of JavaScript. We use defer tag. So is that helpful or is that not helpful? I mean, we don't want to split. We don't need to be there quick. You know, we don't have to be there in the first hype segment. So that helps things. So you know, basically that's good. So we're getting about, I don't know, I'm getting 89 on my speed score. Is that good?
That's pretty good. That's not bad.
That's all right. You know, I shouldn't worry after. At what point on my light speed or Lighthouse or whatever it is button should I stop worrying about speed? 100 or is 70 good enough? You know,
I think once you're in the green, you're kind of fine.
Right, it's all my color. It's a color. It's not the number. It's the color.
Kind of
course.
I would say like maybe 90 is a good point that you want to be at.
Oh, 1 point off. 1 point off. I'm gonna have to go and try again.
Well, I think that the speed test is speed is a relative metric, right? It's like how fast are you compared to every page on the web, or how fast are you versus like say your direct comp set. And so I try to not that page speed isn't important, it's really important, but I think it can be turned into a bit of a tempest in a teapot, so to speak. Like it's just like how fast are you versus your competitor? Because I work with a lot of sites that 65, 70, maybe if they hit 80, they're just overjoyed. But again, and they're just, they're pulling their hair out saying like, how do we get faster? I can't pull out any more JavaScript. We can't make this any faster experience. And I just try to talk them off the ledge. Like, it's okay. It's a relative metric. Faster is better, but like, how fast are you versus, your most direct competitors? And if it's roughly the same ballpark, say 15, 20 points, differential, like I wouldn't sweat it.
So, I mean, on that then, the whole speed thing, it's not just about the JavaScript, the speed, is it? I mean, there's other factors that could be involved, and I suspect that people get a bit hung up and blame it on JavaScript, and it could be traffic on the web or the server again getting hit by a database request or something else, So it could be all sorts of other bits and pieces.
It's also how do you measure, right? Like what might be fast if you measure on your laptop or on your desktop computer, which has like a fiber internet connection. And like a gazillion cores is not what your users might be using. If your users are actually at the other end of the world and they use a 4-year-old Android phone or a 7-year-old iOS phone on a carrier that is edge at best, that's a very different experience.
Yeah, and also I found I had Grammarly installed on my browser as an extension. I think it was Grammarly, and that slowed everything down. And to be fair, Lighthouse did come up and said your extensions are probably messing things up, but you can get some very, very off readings if you allow your extensions to stay on whilst you're doing that sort of thing. So, guys, if there's anybody on Facebook, by the way, we're probably not going to answer those questions live. So if you think we are in live time on Facebook, it might be worth diving over to YouTube. And David, I'm going to let you sort of find the questions and things, so feel free to jump in if there's any that we should bring out. Now, here he is.
Sure. I mean, we had a couple of likes on Facebook, so we're definitely going out live on Facebook with Barry Smith and Fred Laurent liking the video. So thank you very much for doing that. A little bit of interaction on YouTube as well.
but not from David, who's now gone on to pause mode. So that's okay. Fine. We got one here though from Sakti. We have takeaway client. It's a takeaway client. Okay, it's tie up a few service providers like Uber. It's got tied up with and Just Eat and Food Hub. In this case, in order URL Uber. I tell you what, can you just check that one out, David, and I'll get back to that question. I'll just dive on another one. So I couldn't. So Sakti, sorry, you were typing quickly, and there's a few typos in there, and I don't want to get the question wrong. So apologies for that. Right. Okay. Let's go slightly sideways then. Martin, I know you've told me this in great depth, and I've written it up. But on the webinar, if we can say it without the need for pictures and stuff, what is Google's web rendering service?
Basically, it's like an automated bunch of browsers that are taking the crawled pages and then basically open them as your browser would open them. Run the JavaScript and take out whatever content is there after JavaScript has finished running, and then passing that back on to the indexing pipeline.
So, if I'm right, and I think I got this one right. Otherwise you probably told me off and I wrote it up. But so there is no pages going into the indexer, at least not from the core crawl, that are going into the indexer that have not been at least partially gone through this rendering service. So basically, it does, as you say, it doesn't matter whether you've got JavaScript on your page or not got on your page. It only goes into the indexer once. It doesn't do what it used to do years ago, which is go into the indexer and then at some point someone will crawl the rendered version. Is that right?
It's a little more complicated than that, unfortunately.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. It's a fair question. The thing, the tricky thing is, generally, so this has been the case. This has been the case for years, basically. At least 2018. I'm not sure if it has been that way before.
I thought you were going to say at least 2,000 years. I thought.
No. At least 2,000 years, but it has been at least since 2018, probably longer. That kind of every page goes through rendering. However, there was an. It's hard to explain what actually happens, because the way that it actually happens is that a bunch of microservices basically get it. So it's like a message comes into one, and then it fans out to multiple other microservices, and then these do whatever they need to do, and then eventually results come back, and then a data structure, basically like a book, is filled in over time. Like it doesn't happen at the same time. It's not like sequentially, like the first system writes down its thing, the second system writes down its thing. It can be that the first 5 systems write a thing down immediately, the next system takes a day or an hour or a minute or 5 minutes. So a lot of things happen in parallel. And then basically this index document is completed over time. And you can see this also when you think about ranking. We have a bunch of signals, and some signals just take a little longer until they are built, right? Yet the page can hypothetically already rank without having the signal filled into the book that we store in the index, in the library that is our index. And then eventually when we have the information, we go back into the index, take out that particular document, fill in the data, and then it'll rank differently, better, worse, whatever, in later iterations. And similar is how this works. So basically a document can hypothetically show up relatively quickly after it has been crawled. However, it is unlikely that that's going to happen, because then we pretty much very likely do not have much content available yet. And every page goes through rendering at one point. We thought that this is best visualized by the 2 waves metaphor. So we came up with this idea of telling people, like, don't worry about JavaScript. It goes in the index immediately, and then eventually we populate it with the data that comes from JavaScript. That turned out to cause a lot of questions that in reality, like, oh, but what happens if the content that is in the index? And then I'm like, it doesn't really matter, because that's not really a thing that actually happens for like realistic purposes. As I said, like queue time is on I think it's median is 5 seconds. So most likely whenever it's being written to the index, it comes in with the rendered information already. Every page goes through rendering. There are hypothetically there are cases where you might skip rendering, but that's very, very rare. And I'm not even sure if that specific heuristic is still being used. I know that I found references to that heuristic. And when I asked the rendering team, they're like, oh, yeah, ignore that. And I'm like, OK, fine. So I'm not exactly sure if that heuristic is still being employed, because if the cost of that heuristic is higher than the potential benefit, because it fires very, very rarely, then I don't think we would keep that in place. And that's something that like blew some people's minds. They're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, no, if it takes us more effort to find out if we can skip JavaScript, and then even maybe possibly run into situations where that was true at some point, and now that we're doing it, it's not true, and then we have to find out by recrawling something that is basically just an error page at this point, then we are wasting a lot of resources, not just rendering resources, also crawling resources and probably indexing resources, for a minimal gain. It might make more sense to make rendering faster and more ubiquitous.
But you'd still have a timeout, wouldn't you? So if the page wasn't rendering in a certain amount of time, you'd forget that. You know. Yeah,
at some point we have to cut it off. There is not really like a fixed timer. There is, in a way, a timer, but it works in interesting, mysterious ways that warrant its entire own discussion if I only could talk about it, because that's an implementation detail that the team's like, don't talk about it because we might change it at any point in time.
So it's got to the end of a list of things it has to do, and it hasn't got what it needs, and then
yes,
okay, fine.
And there is hypothetically a chance that things could like fail often enough in rendering, not even because of JavaScript, just because of something goes wrong on our side or the rendering service goes down or something. Obviously, that does not block the entire indexing process. We might then still like index things where we say like, oh, we have enough quality signals on this page, so probably JavaScript isn't like the most important thing here, and then we might still put it in the index. But that, again, in practice, that never happens, or basically never happens. And it's really hard to explain how exactly it works, but basically you can assume that every document that lands in the index has been rendered.
Okay, cool. Stuart, unless you want to add something onto that, but I'll come on to a different question. But if you feel free to jump in.
No, I think it also kind of stems from maybe a misunderstanding. I know that Google tried to sort of explain in the early days like how it was starting to understand or process JavaScript, and there's this idea of a two-phased approach. I think unfortunately that's still in most SEOs' minds in terms of like as a profession, that there's this two-phased approach, and so I think it sort of stems from a lack of understanding for how Googlebot behaves. It's not a bot; it's a series of programs that run in parallel. So it's kind of a fundamental breakdown in terms of like the understanding of Googlebot, the understanding of this two-phased approach. It's not really two-phased. I think Martin, has already sort of explained this. It never really was two-phased. There was a rendering part that happened later, but that latency now is so minimal that it's not an issue.
So I'm going to come on to that question by GLSEO in a bit, but just before I do that, Stuart, just before we get off speed, the subject of speed, does minifying JavaScript files help very much? Does that make things faster? Is it worth doing? And how do you do it? What is minifying?
Yeah, well, minifying is basically, it's almost like you think of it, as a URL shortener. I mean, that's the best analogy I can think of when I try to explain what that means. You're basically taking JavaScript and you're sort of minifying the code, sort of minimizing that quote unquote code bloat.
Turning it into binary sort of thing.
Exactly. And it has the potential to speed up the website, but you have to be very careful with the minifying sort of service you decide to run with, like ugly.js, or you can use like Clojure compiler. There are different things you could use, but the danger in minifying is that you can create really broken strings. Like you can start overlapping very complex JavaScript, and then it doesn't fire it off. So you have to be very careful how you use the minifier. It's really meant for just sort of the combination or the minifying of simple strings. But if you're trying to like minify complex JavaScript, I think even Martin could weigh on this, but I don't think that's advisable. I think you will break more than you thought you were actually saving. So
it really is important that you do look into that at the developer level and don't try to like retrofit it, because as a build step, it's really easy to do that. But then if you like have an entanglement of different minified scripts that are independent of each other, then you run into all the problems that were just throw it up.
Yeah, I know. Just realised that if you're going to use a JavaScript, a minifying service, then you've got to use one you can trust, because God knows what they could inject in there at the same time, and that could be a pretty bad move if you just pick one off the shelf or someone you don't trust when you do it. So,
you can also waste a lot of dev time trying to debug something you were trying to make more simple anyway. So just be very careful with how you approach minifying.
Okay. What about inserting JavaScript through Google Tag Manager? Does Google Tag Manager slow down the site or not? No, you can go second, Martin. I'll let Stewart go first, his opinion, and then you can defend it if he goes the other way.
I haven't seen any significant slowdowns leveraging GTM for the injection of JavaScript. So, in fact, it can often be a more preferable way of trying to inject a certain tag. So, but yeah, I haven't seen anything that would indicate that GTM is, an injection of JavaScript through that is a detriment.
Okay.
It just packs a lot of smart things that you can do yourself, that you don't have to do yourself if you use an external library. It comes with a downside that you're now relying on an external service. And I would love to say, at Google, we are perfectly fault-proof, but hell no, that's not the case. It's the same. This reminds me of when I was in IT operations, and we were discussing if we should have our own server infrastructure as our own server hardware long before I joined Google, or if we should just use a cloud provider. And the thing there is, it all comes with trade-offs. If AWS cloud goes down, then there's nothing I can do. I can't drive to an Amazon data center or Google data center or Microsoft data center and knock on the door and say, let me in, I'll fix this now. If they take an hour, they take an hour. If they take a day, then they take a day. There's nothing I can do. Whereas with my own hardware in the data center where I have access, I have control over that. But will me alone or the small ops team that I have available, will we be more efficient and faster than a huge team at a cloud provider? It's the same with Google Tag Manager. If they go down, they go down. And if you have vital pieces of your code running through Google Tag Manager, then you might be screwed. But if it's something that you are if this dies for a day, I'd be okay with that. Then.
So a little anecdote story aside, the very first website I ever built was when I used to write and run Murder Mystery Evenings, and I built it using front page 97. Well, if I could get it to work. I couldn't get 95 to work. I had to get 97. And the only thing I got going for me was I went to the ISP where I could see the building, because I didn't know where my data was going to. I wanted to go somewhere where I could go and bang on the door and get my data back if I needed it. And that's where I chose one with analytics on there and stuff, and figured out that InfoSeek was coming to my website from the States and stuff, and that's how I learned about SEO, really. So anyway, right, okay, I'm gonna jump into the second question from GL SEO, because I really just want to go through this. Is it okay to inject meta tags, canonical and href tags into your pages using JavaScript via Google Tag Manager? If that's okay, I'm going to say yes. But that's because I inject schema and stuff by JavaScript all the time, and it doesn't seem to cause me any problems. So I'm going to go yes. But you guys are happy with yes? Yeah.
Yes, and an asterisk. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to go with the? Okay. So basically, if the asterisks are, don't put in keyword meta tags with every word under the sun.
No, the big thing there is exactly what I just said, where it's you can totally do that, and if that's the viable option, the most viable option, because I know everything depends on the context. Do you have developer resources? If you do not have developer resources, then that is 100 times better than not having good meta tags or no meta tags at all. It's definitely better than not having them because you can't inject them because you don't have access to the code. If that's your only way to do it, do it. Be my guest. Go for it. Yes. If you can somehow put them into the initial content without JavaScript, do so, because why wouldn't you? Why would you rely on JavaScript if you don't have to here? And to be fair though, if the entire main content of the page comes in via JavaScript, then scratch that, because if you don't know what the page is about, then how do you put in a title tag?
Well, I'll tell you a reason why you would use a JavaScript is because, for example, at Inlinks, the about content, the about schema, it can then be modified without having to go back to the developer every single time, and you can then address that. We think that's a really good idea. Obviously, the developer wants more work, so
Again, but it's a hack. It's a hack. Like using GTM to inject, meta tags. It's a hack. I mean, to Martin's point, yes, you can do it, but why would you? I mean, there's always extenuating circumstances. Maybe you don't have the resourcing, but I mean, any solid CMS system will give you access to load HTML meta tags. So for me, that's purely a hack. It's not a bad thing to do necessarily, but it's not optimal. And really, at the end of the day, you're trying to get around, I think, just using a viable CMS that can give you the HTML meta tags there ready to process for the crawlers. So.
Yeah, and as you say, like if developer resources are the breaking point, where you say like we have outdated metadata because we can't reasonably argue to basically run to our developers on a bi-weekly basis and let them rewrite everything on the page, and they can't be asked to provide us with a CMS or provide us with a way to interact with these things, then it's 100% fine to do that with JavaScript. And again, also, if your initial HTML does not contain much to begin with, but like a bare bones JavaScript boot up playing ground, then what's the point? Then sure, go ahead, use whatever JavaScript you use to inject the rest of the content to also inject the meta tags. But if you can provide crawlers, especially those who might not be as good with JavaScript as Google Search's crawler is, if you can provide those with a pre-rendered version, server-side rendered, whatever, I don't care. If you can put it in the initial HTML, why don't you?
Yeah.
If you can, being the key here.
If
you can't, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Josh has a question. Josh Deltner. Do the metrics from Lighthouse come from the initial render, or is that a separate service?
So Lighthouse has nothing to do with the web rendering service or Googlebot. Lighthouse in its purest form, which is in the developer tools of your Chrome, just shows you what happens when you reload the page. I think it clears the cache. I think by default it does, but I'm not sure.
It recommends that you do it in a incognito.
Yeah. So then basically it fetches it over your internet connection, or if the site you are testing in Lighthouse is your local development server, it's not even using the network. It's basically just going to your hard drive. And it has nothing to do with the Google search infrastructure, has nothing to do with initial render or whatever. It's just what you get in the browser.
But effectively, it's sort of emulating part of a headless Chrome browser that, so it's a good approach, I'd say, because it's the user's approach. I mean, it's exactly the same as what the customer is seeing. So if we're going to follow the mantra of don't do what Google wants, do what the customer wants, then I think Lighthouse is a great way to test your site speed and stuff. So. Okay. Sorry, Stu, do you want to add anything there about Lighthouse?
No, I'll just totally be Ringo about that one. Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Happy to
So slightly off. Some mobile sites hide their SEO content. Sorry, Dave, I'm going into the GLSEO one.
Sorry about that.
Production relies on the presenter actually sticking to the script. So there we go. So GLSEO. Some mobile sites hide their SEO content behind a see more button. Does Google rank or weight that's how I say weight this content less if it requires JavaScript to load the content? Is there a best practice way to do this? So stuff behind a more button.
Inherently, it's not a bad thing. It just depends. Like if it's again, JavaScript is not good in terms of how it's rendered if it's an action, right? So if you have to click to actually see the content, that's not a good thing. But not all see more buttons or read more are, a JavaScript action. So that one is definitely, I would definitely need more context around that one. But inherently, there's no problem in terms of like content behind the see more. It depends on how that see more is set up. If to see more you have to click, then Googlebot does not click. So there are no actions that it performs. It just crawls. So go ahead.
I love how you tiptoe around. It depends. Because it depends. It does depend.
Which is my pet hate subject, pet hate answer in SEO. Is,
I know.
Customers don't want to hear that one. But yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what it depends on and what the different outcomes is. And I think we just heard a good bunch of it. So basically, it depends on so there's two parts of this question, actually. One is, does content even get indexed when it's hidden behind the See More button? The other one is, how does it look like in ranking, or how does it get weighted in ranking? For the weighting and ranking bit, I will not say anything because I don't know. And that's not an I don't know, I can't say, but it's an I literally don't know. And I don't know how John and Gary did it, but hypothetically, we're not supposed to have access to these bits of information about like ranking. So I'll just I don't know, don't care. The indexing bit, if the See More button loads more content after a user interaction, we don't see it because Googlebot does not interact with buttons or anything on the page. So it's just as
right.
if the
okay,
content
that's useful to know then.
Yeah, it's just as if the content isn't present on the page. So if you have a huge piece of text and that only comes into the page after you click on the button, gone.
Okay, so you don't click on JavaScript buttons?
No. On no buttons at all.
No buttons.
We don't click on anything.
So yeah. It's a myth that Google link walks. Links walks into an infinite loop. On that one then. So I didn't see it, but you just did a web apps kind of a video, Martin. So is that kind of related? Like if you want to get it crawled, make sure it's all in that first bit of content, in that first download. Okay. Good tip. That was worth coming along to, I think. So that's grand. Okay, I got not many more questions, but we'll do Richard's now then, David. Can you give thoughts on bundling JS into one call? So yes, one of Martin's favorite questions. So we'll let Stewart go first and go into it and walk into that, that tunnel of death as Martin then corrects him without trying to correct him.
Yes, I think it's a good idea to bundle your call. I will leave it at that because I'm going to let Martin do this.
Okay. Yes. No. Good stuff. It is a bit paradox, though. I'm so sorry.
Because if you're going to bundle everything into one call, but you only use 10% of that content on the actual page, then you're actually going to make it worse on you.
Yeah. That's exactly the problem. You have to bundle, but you have to split the bundles, which sounds, if you bring it down to one sentence and say like you have to bundle your code, but you have to split the bundles, then people are like, are you taking a piss or what? Like what am I supposed to do with this information? But you're putting it really, really well, Dixon. It is, you have to basically split it by functionality roughly. So which parts of the code will people experience in one go? So if you have a bunch of libraries or like a bunch of API calls that need to happen to show a blog, then put that into your blog.js. And if you have an e-commerce shop on the side and there's like a bunch of stuff that needs to happen in JavaScript to load the shop, put that into your shop.js. Put them all together. If it's like 100 files each, put them all in one file, but then have like these separate two files, one for the blog, one for the shop, so that if I visit your blog, I don't download the shop. Why would I?
And you know what? That's a really good use of Google Tag Manager as well, because you've got triggers in Tag Manager. You can say, right, download this when you've got the shop pages, but don't download it when it's on the blog pages or whatever. So, so there could be a really good way of delivering JavaScript efficiently, I suppose. So no FAQ dropdowns or tabs help at all, Bianca. Okay, I don't think that's not true, really.
That's not true. No.
There's that's a blanket statement, and I think you can make those things work in case of how you program it, and you don't have to use JavaScript, of course. But but to Martin's point, as if you want it to read it in the first crawl, then make sure that the content gets there in the first download. That's the idea. But if you're going to have JavaScript buttons, then you're going to have a different URL for the next button so that we can see the next one, I think.
And also, just to be very, very clear, it's fine to use JavaScript to fetch it. Just don't hide it behind a user gesture. So even if you're using JavaScript to put your FAQ content in, that's fine. It just has to be in the document object model. You should see it in the rendered HTML in our testing tools. It should not only be loaded when you click a button, a drop down, a select box, whatever. If you have a user interaction that basically pulls the content in, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it's not in the DOM, then it's not going to get it's not going to get rendered.
Yeah. Okay. So use the inspect tool and find out what's in the DOM. Okay. Right, guys. We've hit our time already, but I've got one more question which I've saved for the end. Although we've covered a few, so you're allowed to go back on the old ground if you want. But what is Google bad at seeing in JavaScript? What still need any work? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Anything that's a click, anything that is an action that loads more content, JavaScript, it's great for users, not great for bots. So be careful how you leverage that.
Also, HTML and CSS as well. HTML and CSS both are really fault tolerant. JavaScript really isn't. It's like a all or nothing situation. It's either the entire script works and then you're good, or if there's any problem and we can't continue parsing, then you're out of the game. Then JavaScript's done. Yeah.
Okay, guys, this has been fantastic. We've run out of time again. So before we go, find out from David when the next live show is and what's on, I want to say thanks to the panelists, to Martin and to Stewart. Thank you ever so much. I'll ask you in a minute how we find you and get hold of you, and or not, as the case may be. Thanks as well to Inlinks. If you haven't tried the demo of Inlinks, go to inlinks.net. Play with it and book me up for a demo, and I'll do that. So that's about it. What do we got on next month? Have we worked it out yet, David, or are we? Yeah. Oh, great! I love it when it's organised.
Next month, it is November the 16th at 4 p.m. GMT, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And the show is going to be about what is your site migration checklist. On that particular show, we're going to have Mirko Inameti, Archie Bong, we've got Chris Green and Deb Doot Modal. If you want to find out where to sign up for that, just go to theknowledgepanelshow.com to watch live. Oh, yeah, we got a domain for this now. We're getting pro. It just redirects to a blog page, but we'll pretend it's really cool. We'll get that. So, guys, thank you ever so much. Theknowledgepanelshow.com, and you can also from there just remind yourself where the different links are if you want to get it in in podcast form or all sorts of forms. We're getting more sophisticated. We're even on Spotify these days. So, so guys, just before we go, where can people find out about you from, and when should they and when shouldn't they? Martin.
Best is probably Twitter. Either tweet at me directly. If you search for Martin Splitt, there's pretty much only one Martin Splitt. It's Geekonaut.
Two T's. Yeah. Yeah,
Splitt, not split. And please, whatever question you might be having, I have my direct messages open, but if you ask me questions, I can't really answer them, and I'll say like, sorry, I have to go to the webmaster forum or the office hours. Sorry. Please don't.
You must get a lot of stuff you just can't answer and just have to ignore. So don't go there, guys. We Twitter's good for debate. It's not good for for customer support, really. Stuart, how do they find you?
Just find me on LinkedIn, and just a plug for Martin. Really like the office hours. So definitely, if you have questions about JavaScript, go there. Martin goes above and beyond to try and answer everyone's questions. So
thank you.
Kudos to you. Well done. Well done.
It's brilliant. I think you guys are absolutely brilliant. I appreciate you both coming on. Thanks to the audience for coming in, asking us questions and joining us. And we'll see you again for episode 5 of The Knowledge Show. The Knowledge Panel.
Thank you very much.
Show.com.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.